It all started in a courtroom that should have been a place of justice, but on this day, it became a stage for humiliation. The judge, an older man with years of experience behind the bench, leaned back in his chair, shaking his head with a smirk. His tone was dismissive, almost mocking. "You really think you can argue the law better than me?" he scoffed, staring down at the man standing before him. The courtroom chuckled along with him, as if this was all some kind of joke. But the man in the defendant's seat wasn't laughing. 3 years of his life had been stolen, 3 long, painful years spent behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. And now, after fighting for his freedom with nothing but the law books he studied in prison, he was finally here, standing in front of the very system that had failed him. His name was Marcus Carter, a regular guy with a steady job, a family that loved him, and dreams of his own, until one night everything changed. A wrongful accusation turned his world upside down, and before he even understood what was happening, he was locked away. No evidence, no real investigation, just a system that had already made up its mind about him. For 3 years, he lived in a cage, watching the days slip away. But Marcus refused to be broken. He had no legal background, no fancy degree, but he had something just as powerful, a mind that refused to accept injustice. With nothing but time and desperation, he buried himself in law books, memorizing cases, understanding legal loopholes, learning everything he could. And now here he was, representing himself, armed with nothing but his knowledge and the truth. But instead of being taken seriously, he was being mocked. The judge looked at him like he was nothing more than a fool playing pretend. The prosecutor barely tried to hide his amusement. Even the spectators seemed entertained, whispering among themselves. But Marcus wasn't here to impress them. He was here to prove them wrong. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. He knew the law, and more importantly, he knew his case inside and out. If they thought he was going to stumble, they were in for a surprise. "Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "With all due respect, I'm not here to argue for entertainment. I'm here to prove that I should have never been in that prison cell to begin with." The room quieted slightly. Maybe it was the confidence in his voice, or maybe it was the fact that, despite their laughter, Marcus wasn't backing down. The judge smirked again, flipping through the case file. "All right then, Mr. Carter. If you're such a legal genius, let's see what you've got." Marcus locked eyes with him, determination burning in his gaze. "Gladly," he said. And with that, the real battle began. The courtroom was silent now, but not because they believed Marcus had a real shot. No, they were waiting for him to fail. The judge leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand, as if he were watching a show rather than presiding over a case that had stolen 3 years of a man's life. The prosecutor crossed his arms, smirking, ready to shut Marcus down the moment he slipped up. But Marcus wasn't planning to slip up. He had spent thousands of hours preparing for this moment, studying cases similar to his, memorizing legal arguments, dissecting every flaw in the prosecution's story. And now, standing here, he wasn't just fighting for his freedom, he was fighting for his dignity. He took a deep breath and began. "Your Honor, let's start with the evidence, or shall I say, the lack of it." Marcus stepped forward, his voice steady. The prosecution built its case on one unreliable witness. No forensic evidence, no security footage, nothing that actually linked me to the crime. Just one person's word against mine. The judge raised an eyebrow, but he didn't interrupt. Marcus could tell he was still waiting for him to fumble. Marcus turned to the prosecutor. "And yet, despite having no real proof, they were able to convict me. Why? Because the system saw me as guilty before I even had a chance to defend myself." A murmur ran through the courtroom. The truth was out in the open now. The prosecutor smirked. "Objection, Your Honor. The defendant is grandstanding." Marcus didn't flinch. He expected this. "Sustained," the judge said lazily. "Stick to the facts, Mr. Carter." Marcus nodded, gladly. He walked over to the evidence table, where the prosecution's files sat. He picked up one of the reports. This is the police report from the night of the incident. If you read closely, you'll notice something interesting. The witness changed their story multiple times. First, they said they saw a tall man in a dark hoodie. Then suddenly, they identified me, despite the fact that I was wearing a light-colored jacket that night. A detail conveniently left out during my trial. The prosecutor shifted slightly. Marcus flipped to another page. Then there's this, the missing surveillance footage. There was a camera at the scene, but the footage was never presented in court. Why? Because it mysteriously disappeared before my trial. A coincidence. He let the question hang in the air. The judge's expression tightened, but he remained silent. Marcus could feel the shift happening. The same people who had laughed at him minutes ago were now leaning forward, listening. The doubt was creeping in. But Marcus wasn't done. He turned to the jury. 3 years. That's how long I've been in prison. 3 years of my life gone because the system failed me. And now, after everything, I'm expected to stand here and defend myself against a case that was built on nothing but assumptions and bias. The air in the courtroom grew thick. The judge cleared his throat. Mr. Carter, do you have actual legal arguments, or is this just an emotional plea? Marcus met his eyes, unshaken. Oh, I have plenty of legal arguments, Your Honor. And by the time I'm done, you'll have no choice but to admit the truth. And with that, the real fight began. Marcus could feel the weight of the courtroom pressing down on him, but he refused to let it shake him. Every glance, every smirk, every whispered conversation behind him, it was all meant to make him doubt himself. But he had spent 3 years with nothing but doubt, and it hadn't broken him yet. The judge tapped his fingers on the bench, unimpressed. Proceed, Mr. Carter. Marcus took a step toward the prosecution's table, his movements slow and deliberate. Let's talk about motive, he said, his voice calm. Because that's the one thing the prosecution never really proved. The prosecutor smirked. It's simple. You needed money, you saw an opportunity, and you took it. Marcus almost laughed. That's the problem. They built this case around the idea that I had a reason to commit this crime. But what they didn't tell the jury is that I had a full-time job, a steady paycheck, and zero history of anything remotely criminal. He turned back to the jury, locking eyes with each of them. So why was I the easiest target? Why did they decide I was guilty before the investigation even began? The prosecutor sighed, pretending to be bored. We're not here to discuss feelings, Mr. Carter. Stick to the case. Marcus didn't flinch. That's exactly what I'm doing. Because this case was never about evidence. It was about convenience. He turned back to the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to call a witness to the stand. The judge raised an eyebrow. A witness? Yes. Marcus pointed to a man sitting in the back of the courtroom. He was dressed in a pressed suit, but his discomfort was clear. Detective Harris, the lead investigator on my case. The prosecutor stiffened. Your Honor, this wasn't. Let's hear what he has to say. The judge interrupted, more interested now. Detective Harris hesitated before standing, adjusting his tie as he made his way to the stand. He avoided looking at Marcus. Marcus picked up a document from the table. Detective, during the investigation, did you find any physical evidence tying me to the crime? Harris cleared his throat. No, but... No fingerprints. No. No DNA. No. Marcus held up another file. And isn't it true that there was another suspect at one point? Someone who actually had a criminal record. Harris shifted in his seat. That lead didn't go anywhere. Marcus leaned forward slightly. Or was it ignored? The courtroom was completely still. The judge's expression remained unreadable, but Marcus could tell he was listening more closely now. The prosecutor quickly cut in. Objection, he's speculating. Marcus didn't back down. I'm pointing out inconsistencies, because while I was sitting in a prison cell, the real suspect was never even investigated properly. Detective Harris exhaled. his jaw tightening. Marcus could see it, the hesitation, the guilt just beneath the surface. But whether he'd admit it on record was another story. Before Harris could answer, the judge leaned forward. "Detective, is there anything you'd like to add?" Harris hesitated, gripping the edges of the stand. For the first time, the confidence in his posture faltered. And Marcus knew in that moment that he wasn't the only one who had something to lose. Detective Harris swallowed hard, his fingers tapping against the wooden stand as if he was stalling for time. The courtroom was unbearably quiet now, every eye locked onto him. The air felt thick, charged with something unspoken. He knew the weight of his next words. Marcus watched him closely, his heartbeat steady but his mind racing. He had spent years replaying this moment, imagining what it would take to finally make someone admit the truth. He could see it in Harris's face, the cracks forming in his composure, the war going on inside him. He wasn't just an investigator anymore. He was a man who knew too much, and now, in front of everyone, he had to choose whether to keep lying or finally come clean. The prosecutor leaned forward. "Detective, you don't have to answer speculation." His voice was sharp, controlled, but there was an edge of urgency in it now. He could feel things slipping. Marcus turned, locking eyes with the prosecutor. "I'm not speculating. I'm asking a direct question." His voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Detective Harris, did you or did you not dismiss other potential suspects without a full investigation?" Harris hesitated, then shifted in his seat. "We followed the evidence that was available at the time." Marcus took a slow step toward him. And who decided what evidence was worth following? Harris's jaw tightened. He looked at the judge, then the prosecutor, then finally at Marcus. There was something in his expression, something Marcus had seen before. Guilt. Marcus pressed on. "You had a choice. You could have dug deeper. You could have looked at every angle. But you didn't. Instead, you locked onto me, and you built a case around that decision." The judge cleared his throat. "Detective, answer the question." Harris exhaled sharply. "We." He stopped himself, glanced at the prosecutor, then at Marcus. For a second, Marcus thought he was about to break. But then, just as quickly, Harris straightened his shoulders, regaining control. "We did what we believed was right based on the information we had." Marcus didn't let up. And yet, here we are, in a courtroom, with me proving that information was wrong. Harris said nothing. The tension in the room was unbearable. The jury was watching, some leaning forward in their seats. The judge's face was unreadable, but he was listening more intently now. The prosecutor stood. "Your Honor, this is a distraction. The facts remain. Mr. Carter was convicted based on testimony that the court found credible at the time. If he's claiming otherwise, he needs more than just accusations." Marcus turned, his eyes steady. "You want more." He picked up another document. "Let's talk about the missing footage." The prosecutor's expression darkened. Marcus held up the paper. "I requested records of who had access to the security footage from that night, and guess what I found?" He turned the paper around, pointing at a highlighted name. Detective Harris signed off on the evidence logged the same day the footage was reported missing. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Harris's face paled. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Marcus took a step closer. "So tell me, detective, was it really lost, or was it buried?" The judge's gavel hit the bench. Order. But Marcus knew. This wasn't over. Not yet. The truth was right there, teetering on the edge, waiting to fall. The courtroom was in chaos. Murmurs turned into whispers, and whispers grew into full conversations as people tried to process what they had just heard. The judge banged his gavel again, demanding order, but even he couldn't hide the shift in the room. The weight of Marcus's words hung in the air. Detective Harris looked like a man cornered. He hadn't expected this. No one had. For 3 years, the case had been closed, buried under paperwork and forgotten by everyone except Marcus. And now, in front of an entire courtroom, the cracks were starting to show. The prosecutor stood, forcing calm into his voice. Your Honor, this proves nothing. A name on a log doesn't mean evidence was tampered with. Marcus turned to him, then explained why, after Harris signed off on it, the footage was never seen again. The prosecutor hesitated, but before he could speak, Harris did something no one expected. He reached for the microphone in front of him and leaned in. His voice was low, strained. I didn't erase the footage. The entire courtroom stilled. Marcus narrowed his eyes. Then where is it? Harris swallowed hard, his gaze flickering toward the prosecutor. And that's when Marcus saw it. The fear, not just guilt. Fear. The kind that made a man choose his words carefully. The kind that said there was more to this than anyone realized. Harris exhaled slowly. I was ordered to remove it from evidence. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Marcus's mind raced. Ordered? By who? The prosecutor quickly stepped in. Your Honor, I object to this line of questioning. The judge held up a hand. Sit down. His voice was sharp now, his patience wearing thin. He turned to Harris. Detective, are you saying someone within law enforcement deliberately concealed evidence? Harris hesitated. The prosecutor shot him a look, a silent warning. But it was too late to backtrack. Harris nodded, yes. A chill ran through Marcus. He had been so focused on proving his innocence that he hadn't stopped to think about why they had wanted him guilty in the first place. If evidence was destroyed, if Harris was forced to cover something up, then that meant someone had something to lose. And it wasn't just him. Marcus's grip tightened on the table. Who gave the order? Harris didn't answer. The judge's voice was firm. Detective, answer the question. Harris finally looked up, and when he did, his face was pale. He glanced at the prosecutor again. Marcus followed his gaze. And suddenly, it all clicked. The prosecutor stiffened, his jaw clenched. For the first time all trial, he wasn't smirking. He wasn't mocking. He was silent. Marcus took a slow breath. It was you, wasn't it? His voice was calm, but his heart was pounding. The prosecutor said nothing. Marcus turned back to the judge. Your Honor, I move for an immediate investigation into prosecutorial misconduct. The judge didn't respond right away. He studied the prosecutor, then Harris, then Marcus. And then, for the first time since the trial began, the judge looked uncertain. Something much bigger was at play, and Marcus had just kicked open a door no one wanted him to walk through. The courtroom felt like it had stopped breathing. No one moved. No one spoke. The prosecutor's face was rigid, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The judge leaned forward slightly, his sharp gaze locked onto him. Marcus knew he had struck the nerve. The silence stretched until the judge finally spoke. Mr. Peterson, do you have anything to say for yourself? His voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. The prosecutor, Peterson, forced a dry swallow, but he recovered quickly. This is absurd. The defendant is grasping at straws to avoid taking responsibility for his actions. Marcus exhaled through his nose. Even now, Peterson was trying to twist the narrative, but the energy in the room had shifted. The jury wasn't leaning away from Marcus anymore. They were staring at Peterson. The judge was staring at Peterson. Even the courtroom spectators were whispering among themselves, their focus no longer on Marcus, but on the man who had worked so hard to put him away. Detective Harris lowered his head, rubbing his temple. He looked exhausted, broken, but when he finally lifted his eyes, there was something else there. Resignation. I have evidence, Harris said quietly. Peterson's head snapped toward him. You what? Harris sat up straighter, no longer avoiding the attention. I kept a copy of the footage. The courtroom erupted. People gasped, chairs scraped against the floor, and the judge immediately started banging his gavel. Order, order in this court. But Marcus wasn't hearing any of it. His mind was racing. For 3 years, he had been told the footage was gone. Destroyed, buried. but it had never been erased at all. Harris turned to the judge. I was scared," he admitted, his voice cracking. "I was following orders, but I knew something wasn't right, so I made a copy and hid it. I was too afraid to speak up back then, but now—" He swallowed hard. "Now I can't keep quiet." The judge's expression darkened. "And you're only revealing this now." "I thought it would never see the light of day," Harris admitted. "But if I don't say something now, then I'm no better than them." The bailiff stepped forward as the judge turned to Peterson. "Mr. Peterson, I'm ordering an immediate review of this case and the alleged misconduct. If there is any truth to this claim, you will be held accountable." Peterson's face was unreadable. "This is a mistake," he muttered, shaking his head. But Marcus could see it, the panic, the knowledge that things were crumbling. The judge wasn't finished. "Detective Harris, turn over the footage immediately." Harris nodded, already reaching for his phone. Marcus let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It was happening. The truth was finally coming out. But just as he thought the fight was over, Peterson turned to him with something strange in his eyes. Not fear, something else. A slow smirk crept onto his face. "You think this is a victory?" His voice was low, almost amused. "You have no idea what you just started." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. Because somehow he knew. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Marcus stared at Peterson, his mind racing. Even in the face of an unraveling case, the man didn't look defeated. He looked like someone who still had something up his sleeve. But Marcus wasn't afraid. Not anymore. The judge wasted no time. "Bailiff, take Mr. Peterson into custody pending further investigation." The order was firm, final. A hush fell over the courtroom as Peterson's expression finally cracked. His smirk disappeared, his confidence shaken. The bailiff stepped forward, and for a brief moment, Marcus saw it, the realization in Peterson's eyes that his power was slipping away. He had controlled the narrative for years, but now the truth was breaking through. As Peterson was led away, Marcus let out a slow breath. He turned back to Harris, who was still sitting in the witness stand, looking drained. Marcus didn't know whether to feel anger or gratitude toward him. Harris had helped ruin his life, but in the end, he had chosen to do the right thing. The judge's voice broke the silence. "Mr. Carter, based on these new developments, your conviction is officially overturned. You are free to go." Marcus felt his chest tighten. The words felt unreal, like a dream he had forced himself not to have for years. He glanced at the jury, at the people in the audience who had doubted him, mocked him, dismissed him. Some looked ashamed. Others avoided his gaze completely. But it didn't matter, because he had done what they said was impossible. As he stepped out of the courtroom, the fresh air hit him differently. The weight he had carried for 3 years was finally gone. But the world outside had changed. He wasn't the same man who had been taken away in handcuffs. He had spent years learning, studying, understanding the system that had tried to break him. And now, he had the knowledge and the voice to make sure no one else went through what he had. Harris approached him hesitantly. "Marcus, He sighed, rubbing his temples. "I can't change what happened, but I can make sure it never happens again." Marcus studied him for a moment before nodding. "Then do that. You didn't have to say anything else." Harris knew that forgiveness wasn't something he could ask for. Not yet. As Marcus walked down the courthouse steps, a reporter shoved a microphone toward him. "Mr. Carter, now that you're free, what's next for you?" Marcus didn't hesitate. Justice. Because this wasn't just about his case. It was about a broken system that needed to change. And if no one else was going to fight for it, he would. As the cameras flashed, as voices called his name, he walked forward, not as the man they had tried to erase, but as the man they could no longer ignore. His story wasn't over. It was just beginning.